Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Welcome tonight. This is really wonderful. This is the final lecture in a series that I've been doing for the Y for the last year called Gods and Prophets, talking about the origins, the evolution, theories, and conceptions of God and faith and religion. And this particular lecture tonight is one that I've been looking forward to for a long time. I mean, the topic is, of course, the future of God, the merging, if you will, of scientific and religious ideas, and what will become of religion 100, 1,000, maybe 10,000 years from now. But I'm also really looking forward to tonight because two of my very good friends are my fellow panelists, and some of you are familiar with both David and Andrew. I'll tell you a little bit about both of them. Andrew Zolli, of course, is the director of PopTech. Some of you may be familiar with PopTech. It's an incredible organization, a global innovation network that brings together thinkers and doers once a year, I believe in Maine, in beautiful Maine. He's also a fellow at the National Geographic Society. He's written for Vanity Fair, for the New York Times. His ideas have appeared on such places as the National Public Radio. And of course, he is the author of this incredible book called Resilience, which will be for sale outside, Why Things Bounce Back. And I couldn't recommend this book more. So please welcome Andrew Zolli. And our second guest is David Eagleman. David is a great friend, a brilliant neuroscientist at Baylor College in Texas. He directs the Laboratory for Perception and Action and the innovative initiative on neuroscience and law. I'm having a hard time speaking for some reason. He's the author of numerous wonderful books, best-selling books, including Wednesday is Indigo Blue, Discovering the Brain of Synesthesia, Why the Net Matters, and also Some 40 Tales of the Afterlives. His best-selling book, Incognito, will also be available tonight after the event, and David will be signing it in the back room. So please welcome David Eagleman. I guess I'll sit in the middle. Okay, so as you know, those of you who have come to the other parts of this lecture series, we're going to do things a little bit differently. Instead of having a conversation up here for 30 to 40 minutes and then opening it up to Q&A, what I like to do is get the audience involved pretty much right away. So we'll get started. We'll start the conversation, and you all have cards, and I believe that have been passed out. Simply just start putting your questions on there every 10, 15 minutes or so. Do you not have cards out there? I see a lot of confused faces. So the ushers will come around and make sure that everybody has cards. Just go ahead and start jotting down your questions right away. You don't need to wait for a Q&A time, and then the ushers will pick them up every 10 minutes or so and bring them up here, and we will integrate your questions into the conversation. And that goes for everyone joining us across the country. Before we can talk about the future of God and where concepts and ideas of God are going in the near and distant future, I feel like we should begin by talking about the past of God. Where did God come from? This is, of course, a complex question, and it all really depends on how you approach it. My field tends to be anthropology and sociology, and there are a number of theories about where the concept of God arose. Anthropologists like to talk about something called supernaturalism, the idea being that human beings confronted with the fact that they themselves were not responsible for either their own existence or the existence of the things around them, ultimately endowed nature with these spiritual qualities. Perhaps they had dreams that were sort of ecstatic experiences, or they had an encounter with nature that then compelled them to create an entire mythology around these experiences, which ultimately gave birth to religion. Sociologists tend to sort of look at it from a different point of view. In other words, they don't prioritize myth in the way that anthropologists do. They tend to prioritize ritual. And so in many ways, sociologists will say, well, religions arose because as communities were forced to live together, whether it was in caves or in villages or what have you, there was a need to sort of codify correct practices in order to maintain a sense of order. And as a result, these ritualized processes began. And then the mythology arose later to explain why we do the things we do. So in other words, anthropologists tend to say this is what we believe, and then those beliefs led to rituals. Sociologists tend to say these are the things we do, and those things led to myths. I want to turn to Andrew, who's written a lot about sort of psychological and sociological explanations, particularly in resilience, for the human mind and the individual and the community to sort of adapt, right? To adapt to these situations. And you have kind of a different idea about sort of where religion could have arose and why it is a useful thing.
Yeah, well, first of all, I just want to say hi. It's nice to see all of you. We're going to talk about the future of God, and now we're also going to talk about the past of God. So I'd like to welcome you to the most overpromising hour of stage time that's ever been undertaken by three men in shiny shirts.
The shiniest shirt, though. Right.
That's right. We are some sort of chromatic key. We generally get brighter from left to right. So, I think as a way to begin thinking about this, two kind of signature ideas to play with, and we're all playing with these ideas. The first is that faith, personal cosmology, and belief in things beyond the kind of natural physical spaces that we occupy clearly is adaptive. That is to say, we're beginning to see how those kinds of beliefs actually confer value on the holders of those beliefs in certain circumstances. There's a field of psychological research called hardiness research, which studies why some people in circumstances in which they might naturally be expected to be traumatically compromised by circumstances aren't. And it turns out that a number of researchers have found that if you believe certain things about the world, it's a very complex story about who is resilient and who isn't. It involves your health and your genes and your social networks and access to resources, but also your beliefs and your habits of mind. So I just want to pick the belief part for a moment to start the conversation. So in hardiness research, what researchers have found is if you believe the world is a meaningful place, if you believe that you have agency within that world, and if you believe that successes and failures are placed in your path to teach you things, not merely are the capricious whims of an uncaring and random universe, you're more likely to process potentially traumatic events and the emotional and potentially traumatic emotions attached to them much more healthily than people who don't. And this is one reason why systems of faith may have been convergently evolved over and over and over again in the human story. That is to say, because there are all the kinds of things you have to believe in order to believe that in a system of faith, whether you're a Jainist, a Jew, a Christian, Buddhist, fill in the blank. And so certainly one place to start is that certain kinds of beliefs in our long history have conferred psychological adaptiveness and resilience upon them, and if they are not religious or spiritual, they rhyme. And so that's one important part of the story. And then I think the other part of the story is that faith is not just adaptive, but highly adaptable. That is to say, systems of faith have changed as key moments in the human narrative have evolved over time to bring us to today. And I don't want to keep going.
No, that's great. No, that's great. So I'm going to just move it over to David here, and we're talking about these sort of, well, I would say evolutionary advantages to faith. Is that how you would put them?
Well,
I mean, there are advantages to adaptation.
Well, in the broad story of evolution, certainly it's true that cooperation and competition are both parts of the evolutionary story. But what I'm describing, I think, happens in the realm of culture.
I see.
So it evolves over and over again as a sort of set of cultural adaptations and psychosocial adaptations. And these are essential because they confer the ability to withstand a world that is not well known to us in its causes. Why did this particular thing happen, good or bad? How do we interpret that? That's a huge part of understanding. That question gets asked by us on a daily basis, by our communities over and over and over again around the world. The work that I and my colleagues have done have been to go from the coral reefs of Palau to the backstreets of Palestine and all of these other places around the world and look at the kind of underlying heuristics of resilience. But we can talk about that.
Yeah. So, David, I mean, that's an argument I've heard a lot, and it's one that I think certainly in the scientific field is quite prevalent. In my field, in sort of the history of religions, one of the things that my colleagues and I always talk about is the remarkable ways in which the myths and the metaphors, the stories that human communities have used throughout time, regardless of how much they've been separated by distance or by years, how remarkably similar they are. And one of the things that we hear a lot nowadays from scientists is that, well, they're similar because they all have the same root, which is that they're all these questions that are being asked by the same mind, and that there's something about the chemistry of the brain that fosters this kind of belief. As a neuroscientist, is that something that you would advance as an idea about when we're talking about where does religion come from?
Yeah. Okay. So let me say a few things. One is that if you ask two scientists, you'll get three opinions on all these matters. So it's not as though the whole community agrees. But it is the case that if there's some sort of group selection, if there's an advantage to having a particular way of operating, then on average, the groups that do that will survive better than groups who have, let's say, the anti-religious stance where they feel they can do whatever they want to their neighbors and so on. And so if that's the case, the idea is that becomes a part of who we are as a species. We're a cooperative species. We subscribe to rules and subscribe to something that's larger than ourselves to navigate our behavior. If all that's true, then it is for sure going to be found in the brain. Not necessarily the chemistry, more like the architecture of the brain, the anatomy of it, but essentially any sort of predispositions that we have as humans is all in the end rooted here. Now, as far as identifying specifically where a belief in God is, that is part of this overpromise here where there's no way we can identify that yet. But it should be noted that many of history's prophets, it is now thought, it's just a speculation, but it's now thought that they might have had temporal lobe epilepsy. And that's because people who have epilepsy in a particular part of their brain will hear a voice, and almost universally, they will attribute that voice to God. So an example is Joan of Arc, who turned the tide of the 100 Years' War by telling all these French soldiers, I mean, she was 13 years old, but she told all these French soldiers, look, I heard the voice of God. The first time she heard it, she was in her father's garden in the summertime. She heard a voice. She looked around. There was nobody there. She felt God was talking to her. That was her interpretation. And she led the French to victory. So it's easy to see that if you give somebody anti-epileptic medications and the seizures go away, then the voice of God stops also. So they're clearly related, and these can be stimulated also. So this doesn't answer the question of why human brains believe in God, but it is to say when you hear voices given particular things, then often it's attributed to God.
When I hear a voice in my head, it's usually my wife's.
Yeah.
That's a different.
See, I want to talk about this a little bit more because you're right. This is, I mean, I've heard this many times, and there are areas of the brain that you can stimulate to then mimic a spiritual experience and all of those things. But so I guess my question is that if we're talking about God as some kind of transcendent reality, how would God speak to anyone?
It does not rule.
Because we know how it's, like,
exactly.
we know the
One could make
mechanics of
the
it.
argument that the seizures are the portal to some other universe, to some other dimension. So for sure, it doesn't tell us one way or another about the ground truth of what's going on. It does tell us that it is possible, though, by stimulating it, to open that portal.
To open that portal.
Interpret it.
Yeah. There's other ways to stimulate a godly experience besides just, stimulating the brain. But so, Andrew, going back to kind of what these humans at the individual level and at the communal level provides precisely for, these means of adapting and dealing and being resilient, in other words. So can you talk about particular moments in history in which this kind of adaptation sort of has burst onto the historical scene, and what does that look like?
Yeah. So there have been a couple of attempts to give some shape to the history of our understanding, our imperfect and evolving understanding of divinity. And I think it's important even to remember, even when you asked that question of David a moment ago, that you used God in the word God in the singular, which is itself a cultural construct. That's a decision. If we were having this discussion in Greece 2,000 years ago, we might have had some different verb tenses, and we might have had some different plurals and singles in different parts of those words. So if we think about that story, I'll share with you, not everyone here is necessarily a scholar of religion, but a German philosopher, Karl Jaspers, introduced an idea some time ago called the axial age. It's a period of human history that begins about 800 BCE and ends about somewhere between 200 BCE and the beginning of the Common Era, in which in Persia, in Greece, in Judea, in China, in India, there was a kind of pivot that happened. And that pivot was a shift in which many of the contemporary notions of religious practice, things that would be formalized into religious practice, sort of burst upon the scene, which is a very narrow window if you think about the entirety of human history. So what was going on then? That was a time of the rise of transnational empires and the rise of market economies. The creation of coinage, actually, was first showing up. People were being taken from their communities, which were small or nomadic or sedentary, but they had relationships with the deity, with their deity. And their deity was a contract between the people and the god. And gods competed, and they went bowling together. They did all kinds of things. They just read the ancient stories of the Greeks and the Romans. Sure. They do a lot of stuff, hanging out with human beings and messing around with them for their own pleasure and the like. And then what you get is a fundamental shift in the way human beings are living on the earth, and people are taken out of their natural or their previous cultural context, and they're thrown into cities. And in the process of being thrown into cities, they're exposed to lots of different ideas. And religion has to adapt. Religious practices adapt. First of all, the social contract changes. It goes from being mediated at the group level to being mediated at the individual level. So now I carry, it's like I used to have my record collection at my house, and now I keep my iTunes library in the cloud. This is sort of similar thing goes on with God, right? We have the village deity, and we have the place where we worship the village deity, the communal deity, and now I take that relationship with me into the world. And as that process occurs, you get a fundamental shift. And this is one of the reasons why, if you look at things like, I'll just take Christianity, which was the tradition I was raised in. If you look at the context within which Christianity emerged, it was a social technology of the newly urbanized poor. It was a mechanism, if you looked at who practiced it and what kinds of problems it resolved, it asked questions about, hey, I have this relationship with, by the way, the very definition, the visualization of God changes in that period from being one that looks like, let's say, Reza, to being the bright, shiny light that we can't, the thing beyond description. And in that context, not only do our religious contracts become portable, but they work for us where we are being reconfigured into social orders where we might suddenly be at the bottom, right? So those of you who are least shall be first, right? What do we give to Caesar, and what do we keep? All those kinds of questions get asked and answered as religious questions, and against that kind of backdrop. But this happened in Buddhism, and it happened in Zoroastrianism, it happened with the Greeks. So some scholars, Karen Armstrong, the theologian among them, have asked the question, are we living through a second axial age now? Does the rise of the, and by the way, she means it's starting with the Enlightenment, right, a kind of scientific age, right? But at this moment in history, if you think about it, we are living through what is now the sixth great extinction over the course of billions of years, and various times when the biodiversity of planet Earth has collapsed. And we are today, as we sit here together in this room and connected on the internet, living through one of those moments. Biodiversity is collapsing on planet Earth. And we're living through a giant explosion in human knowledge and capacity. The folks at IBM recently reported that all the data that human beings own, 90% of it was produced in the last 2 years. And that's just because we've gotten so good at producing it that we've vastly increased our capacity for producing stuff. So we're living sort of through the second Renaissance and the sixth extinction at a moment when we're scraping up against planetary boundaries. And the question is, will faith reconfigure itself now? And in a third and fourth axis, what might be the triggers for reconfiguring our notions, our practices, our relationships?
Oh, I've got one. When we discover life on other planets, that's going to really force, because everyone forgot to mention that in their holy books, right?
Right.
Yeah. So we're going to really have to redo it at that point.
Yeah, it's actually a good question. So yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with you, David. One good question is whether or not we discover life on other planets. What comes first? Do we discover life on other planets, or do we actually invent something that looks very much like a mind?
Yeah, so that's what I was going to say.
We lose the sense that there's something unique to
Yeah,
you.
as we start developing ideas of artificial intelligence, and as we start to recognize, look, if we're saying that that the mind has created God, and that doesn't mean God doesn't exist or God doesn't. We've talked about this. I mean, everything that exists is created by the mind anyway, in some sense. So, of course, the mind also creates God. But if that's the case, God's. And by God, I'm by no means talking about an old man who lives up in the clouds. I just mean the transcendent other, the transcendent reality, that which is beyond, that which cannot just be reducible to the matter and its interactions. If that's the case, I mean, if we're saying that the mind creates God, but that, as and by no means am I an expert on quantum physics at all. In fact, I barely understand it. But if this notion that is gaining currency, that the conscious observer is creating reality, or it is an integral part of the creation of reality, what happens when that conscious observer is an artificial life? I mean, is that a moment in which we're going to have to start rethinking what the very concept of God means?
I think when we get real, meaningful artificial intelligence, it might be a redefining era, but not because of quantum mechanics reasons. The observer thing, let's leave that to the side for 1 minute. It's just what you guys were both hinting at the beginning, which is there's not something special about our kind of intelligence, and it's probably not that far off, somewhere between 20 and 2,000 years from now, that we will have machines that are not only so much smarter than us, but they can sort of, like running a virtual machine inside of them, they can simulate what it's like to be a human, so they can talk to us in a way that we'll understand. We'll be like their little children that they talk to, but beyond our intelligence, they'll have a lot more going on. And so when we do reach that, I mean, in some sense, we've already got the other part. I mean, the desktop cell phone is, can do 3 billion floating point mathematical operations in a second. So we've already got artificial intelligence. What we mean by it, though, is something that can talk with us and feels like a human. But yes, I mean, you guys probably know that AI at this moment is a failed field. It's just, what we've discovered is it's a really hard problem. And throwing all our smartest people at it since the 1960s, we still haven't really figured out the structure of intelligence. And so now the game has turned to neuroscience, where we try to figure out, all right, what has Mother Nature figured out over billions of years and trillions of experiments? And we're figuring out how to learn principles from this 3-pound organ. But yes, once we've got that, that'll for sure cause a shift.
Can I just interrupt for a second? So you've all got cards now? So if you just roll them up and smoke them, this conversation is going to get a lot better. So what I want to...
By the way, let me just, before you go...
Yeah, the 90 Seconds CY does not endorse the use of marijuana during its performances, just so that
It'll
we're
make
clear.
this much better. But if you have written your question, just put them up in the air and the ushers will come and grab them and bring them to me. I'm sorry, go ahead, Andrew.
Well, talking about life on other planets and talking about artificial intelligence truly might reinforce the concept that, 3 very left-brain guys on stage talking about it's sort of like left brain science and science fiction fan oriented versions of the future. But so let's talk about some others. Like, for instance, I'm not sure if we held this conversation going forward 500 years that the composition of this stage, which just happens to be accidental, we all know each other and like each other a lot, will be quite the same. I mean, we're already headed toward just take the cultural context of our country. The future of the United States is demographically older and younger. It's so we're talking about the huge young population concurrent with an enormous older population. It's browner by all shades. It's more female. And over the long term, evolutionary long term, it may be permanently female. There are plenty of species that become almost entirely female. David could talk about this more in a second, but one of the reasons why the Y chromosome looks like a Y chromosome is because it's been taking damage for ages and ages and ages. The male chromosome is why men don't live as long, or some hypothesize that this is the case. And so, one of the things to understand is just who we are conditions our understanding of what that omnipresent other is.
That's absolutely
that's a real
true.
change.
That's absolutely true. I mean, if you look at the past, if you're looking at agrarian societies, you tend to be much more mother deity. If you're looking at societies that are deeply hierarchical, then you have a very hierarchical sense of heaven. So, are you saying what it seems to me what you're saying is that as human societies change in these fundamental ways, then our idea of God is good. So God is going to be basically a brown woman, is what you're saying.
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure about the color or the gender, but I just say, I was trying to pick a couple points in history, in our relatively near term, in our a little bit further out term, in our deep evolutionary future. Yeah. And I mean, just to pick one historical example, because we'll just ping pong back and forth in time a little bit. 500 or 600 years ago, 75% of the world's GDP was produced in 2 countries, India and China. And then, as a result of,
Ignore that.
They were about to say a giant hook was about to take me off the stage. That'll be enough, Mr. Zolli. So if we think about the cultures that have defined human society, here's a really tiny example. There's a wonderful French sinologist, student of Chinese culture, named Francois Julian, who wrote a fantastic book, which I'd encourage you all to read, called The Propensity of Things. It's about a Chinese concept that doesn't have its own school of thought, but floats in the language, called shi. And shi is translated variously as all the kinds, but it stands in this particular translation for propensity. It is in the nature of 2 systems opposed. They have a propensity to some outcome. And it shows up in art and culture, in religious and spiritual practice. It shows up in war. And so I think one of the things we have to think about is that the palette of concepts that we may borrow upon for defining these don't just derive from the intersection of science and today's version of spirituality and faith, but interact. Those 2 things are themselves changing in time. And so their interaction, their dance together is not between a static set of faiths and a dynamic set of scientific experimental results, but two things that are also in dynamism.
That's true, although we might argue that science is moving really fast right now and not so much with faith. And so one of the things, I was interested in this thing you mentioned about the
two
visualization.
separate speeds of evolution. I mean, religion is evolving, but science, right.
Exactly. So one of the things that interests me, Andrew, that you mentioned about when people moved from villages into more urban environments, their visualization changed about God. And the reason I think that's really interesting is because you can imagine when you're in the village, all you see is Reza. So what else are you, and here's a handsome God like, so you call him, okay. But when you go out and you start getting a notion of how big the world is and other cultures and so on, you're allowed to zoom out a little bit and have bigger ideas. And what's happening right now is big data, not just in terms of the 2 years of collecting more data, but in terms of figuring out clever ways of visualizing it. And what we're doing right now is understanding ourselves on totally different space and time scales. And this actually has been happening for a little while. The theory of evolution by natural selection would not have been possible without thinking about giant time vistas, really large time vistas. And of course, essentially since Galileo's day, we've been thinking about larger and larger distances in the cosmos and the number of planets and this sort of thing. Actually, I know I'm a big fan of the Hubble Ultra Deep Field experiment, where NASA took just a little dark spot of sky and trained the Hubble the Space Telescope on it, and discovered in this little patch 10,000 galaxies in what looked like darkness, right? So we're getting much better at thinking about time and space scales, and we see ourselves this way when you see social networks, when you see genealogies, genetic genealogies through time, this sort of thing. And as we zoom out more and more, our concept of God might have to change.
Well, this is actually, a great transition to this question, because it's very much along these lines of the evolution of technology. And the question is about how, as technology continues to advance and faster and faster, obviously, and as we have not just the integration of devices with human systems, but greater and faster access to knowledge and modes of knowing, all those issues. And even if we go so far as to think about the integration of this stuff into the brain, right? So the Google that's actually a microchip in my brain. The question is, how will the person of the future, 200, 300, 400 years from now, be able to even differentiate himself from God?
I think that our distant descendants will be cognitive strangers unto us, and it will be impossible for us to know what it is like to be them. And so it's hard to answer that question.
It's a Nietzschean.
What's that?
I said that's a very Nietzschean way of thinking about.
Yeah, and the reason I think that is because, look, we have so much more experience than our ancestors, even just a couple hundred years. We see more colors than they do. They never saw fluorescent or neon. They never saw planes flying in the sky. They never saw big data. I just saw a presentation where, it was big data analysis about the airplanes in the air at any given time. There are 1 million people above the planet at any given moment, which I thought was really interesting. But anyway, we have ways of understanding big patterns and pictures now that our ancestors didn't. But just imagine where this is going as we start plugging things in. Just one thing I'll mention it by example is in the Texas Medical Center where I work, they've invented this continuous flow heart. So blood passes through and gets oxygenated, but you don't have a pulse any longer. And that means that when you get scared or nervous or something, you don't have a quickening of your heartbeat. And we are so embodied as creatures that when you think about anger or fear or whatever, it relies on that. And as our bodies change and we become more and more bionic, which is already happening in so many ways, if you fast forward 1,000 years, we might not have any capacity to sit in their shoes nor their ours, and all of our literature might be not quite understandable to them.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Some of our literature is not understandable to me today. There's a again, for people who might be new to one part of the conversation, there is a conversation in some circles. It's actually an idea that skipped from speculative fiction, which is not quite science fiction, into reality, which was an appreciation by an idea by a man named Werner Vinge, who is a writer who talked about something called the singularity. And the singularity is looks at this forward curve that goes like this exponentiated curve. It's generalized in computing. It's called Moore's law. The speed of microprocessors doubles every 18 to 24 months, but it goes like this. If you look at a curve that goes like this, where the capacity of technology increases along some exponentiated curve, it means that you get bigger and bigger jumps over the same discrete time. So day by day, the amount of change gets bigger on a daily basis, to a point where it's going so vertical that you literally just can't see tomorrow because it's so fundamentally different from today. Now, I think some of this is actually a religion for geeks. That's a geek religion. Because what they believe is in a kind of transubstantiation. I will be able to jack my forehead into the internet, upload my consciousness, and live on the internet, precisely because most of them are not in touch with their bodies in the way that David described. But the thing that's interesting about that to me is we have lived through countless singularities. Agriculture was a singularity. The printing press was a singularity. The internet itself was a singularity. The sense that our ancestors, I have parents who are in their 70s, and I'm living in a world they fundamentally do not get in some very important respects. And that's extraordinary, right? Because so I think it's important to understand that, yes, that's true, what you just described. I certainly agree that our deep ancestors are going to be incomprehensible to us, but I'm not sure that comprehensibility is the core thing. In fact, in some ways, the tradition, the narrative, we are also narrative creatures, regardless of how many stories we're exposed to, how many terabytes of stories we have access to. We are narrative creatures, and in fact, many of these traditions, in addition to encouraging modes of thinking, modes of appreciation, cooperation, forgiveness, justice, all the other normative human values, they are also the narratives of us. And so I'm not sure that they disappear when we become a different.
Narratives change, though.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, do you I'm not sure what you were getting at, but do you think that narratives might?
I'm not sure I know what I was getting at either.
No, I love what you said. I mean, I don't know where the final point was. Do you think that because we're narrative creatures, that our narrative will be the same as far as religion goes?
Well, I would just say I read spiritual texts that are literally thousands of years old and draw sustenance and instruction and some sense of comprehensibility of the world through them. Do I think of them as literally true in every respect? It's sort of irrelevant to me. And could they have understood me as a reader? Could the author of those stories have understood me as a reader? I think absolutely not, for all the reasons that you mentioned.
Well, I'll take that even one step further. I mean, I think it's this notion of Scripture as literal is actually quite a new concept. It in many ways is a result of the scientific revolution. The idea that truth is something that is empirically verifiable was a real shock to the system of religion. And so many religions, and this is where the term fundamentalism arose, many religions responded to that conception by then forcing that same kind of empirically verifiable notion of truth on their scriptures. But as any historian of religion will tell you, the people who wrote these scriptures had no conception of that kind of truth. They by no means thought that what they were writing were sort of verifiably factual or true events. They had they wouldn't have any idea what we talk about when we say history in that regard. But it does bring me to an interesting point that you sort of segued to, which is, David, we've had this conversation. You know, I'm really fascinated by the way in which the language of religion, as I have studied it for all my life, and the language of science, particularly some of the more theoretical, conceptual fields of science, how that language is starting to become startlingly similar. And one of the examples that I use often in this regard is, I think about Sufi mysticism. The Sufis believe, they define God as reality. In other words, existence, pure existence. So when a Sufi says, God, he means God is the substance of God is pure existence. And so anything that exists, anything, you, me, these note cards, which I hope you're still filling out and waving in the air, everything that exists only insofar as it shares in the substance of God. And then the corollary of that is then everything is God. And I'm really fascinated by some of the language I hear from scientists and this idea of kind of the entanglement of things, that if all matter, if all reality can be traced to a kind of Big Bang experience, then at the elemental level, they're interrelated, that they're integral to each other. So everything that exists is, in a sense, exists from the same thing. That sounds very mystical to me. I mean, well, how do you think about it? I know you disagree, but
it's not that I disagree. I mean, and who knows what the right answer is, but it is the case that because of convergent evolution, you can get two different traditions coming to the same way of phrasing something, but not for the same reasons. And it doesn't sort of scaffold or justify one if the other one came to it from hard work. So, and I would assert, just as a speculation, that you could take any new scientific discovery and you could pore through the religious texts of the world's religion and find something that sounds like it shares the language.
Sure, but would you go one step further and say that, I mean, could you then think of this as two different modes of knowing, two different means of describing reality? Or would you just simply dismiss one as the product of a lazy mind?
I'm going to quote my friend Jerry Orstrom from a dinner party last night. He said, there are multiple ways of experiencing the world, but there's really only one way of understanding the world. And by that, now this is a controversial statement, but his point was that by using the scientific method and trying to not just make assertions, but try to build a scaffolding and test it and knock down its own walls and keep building it, that's a way to understand what's going on. There are many, many ways of experiencing and getting lots of joy out of it. And I will say, as a scientist, it's completely clear that the toolbox of science is limited. And most of the interesting things we want to talk about are beyond the science toolbox anyway, which means all of us are in this position of trying to figure out what we think are beautiful hypotheses, and we can't know. But for those things that we can subject to test, then it makes sense to carve our possibility space by doing so. And I just want to mention one thing, because it's probably not worth pinning down our definition of what we mean by God in this conversation, but you did mention that you said, okay, that which isn't molecules moving around. But then when you mentioned the Sufi idea and the Big Bang, what I
said was a transcendent reality. So in other words, that which is beyond, but not beyond the material realm. I mean, I do believe that reality is more than just the sum of the material world. But I think that if you want to talk about God, you can't talk about God as being something that's outside of that realm, but you can't talk about it as being beyond, being sort of experientially beyond. I think that's what I meant. So,
do you mean always experientially beyond, or just at the moment?
I don't know what that means.
I mean, in 100 years, could we understand God? Just by way of example, let's imagine that really what's going on here is that we were planted here by an alien species that is 1 billion years more advanced than we are. Their technology is where we will be in 1 billion years from now. We cannot, in this year, even comprehend what's going on. But it doesn't mean we won't know. I mean, we might catch up at some point.
I think what you're talking about is Scientology.
I don't know much about Scientology, but it's a perfectly good hypothesis that we were. But I don't know if you're dismissing. I mean, that was.
I'm not dismissing anything. I think that's actually their. They're not panspermia in quite the way that you're describing, but it's...
Right. What I'm describing is look, Francis Crick and Leslie Orgel suggested this in a scientific paper,
right.
and a bunch of people jumped on them and said, oh, these two great scientists believe in aliens. But we don't even use the word believe. It's not believing in. It's saying of the possibility space, it's a hypothesis. And the notion of God is also a hypothesis. It's a very beautiful hypothesis, and as people moved from villages to cities and so on, it's a perfectly good hypothesis to think about. It's the refinement of the hypothesis, I think, that's in question, which is, okay, what's going on? Is it merely that Mother Nature is so beautiful that the interactions have emergent properties? Is it that we were planted here by alien species a billion years in advance? Is it a guy on a cloud with a beard, like Reza with a beard or something? And so
here's...
I'll play the role.
Here's a I'll share a tiny bit of my own personal narrative in relationship to some of these questions. So I started out in philosophy. And when you start out in philosophy, I mean, you start out with the pre-Socratics. I mean, you go way back. And if you're lucky enough actually to be taught by Jesuits, they're fantastic in this subject matter, as I was. And a really fascinating set of things occurred to me in my encounter with this corpus of ideas, and really an amazing set of ideas. And that intuition was, between the time these questions were asked by men in sheets with grapes on tables, and today, we actually have some data. We actually know some things about the human mind that we didn't know then. We have imperfect tools, but we have tools. We had no tools. They were questions of pure abstraction when they were asked, but they are questions of relevance today. So basic questions of moral judgment, of when you decide someone is a good or a bad person, under what circumstances, those are experimentally tested hourly around the planet by psychologists and by neuroscientists and by social psychologists and social scientists of all different stripes. And I think what happens is, we can have this conversation about, for instance, the relationship between religion and God and science, and what you get is a one kind of socialized dialogue between those two fields. If you shift it to religion's cousin, which is philosophy, what you actually get is a very different set of relationships between philosophy and science, which is actually much more collaborative and much more interesting, and in which philosophical statements, subject to experimental validation, subject to the illumination of new tools, there's a whole extraordinary field called cognitive science that exists at the intersection of those fields. So I think what we are reserving, I was thinking about that as you were discussing this, David, and what I was thinking is that what we reserve unto faith is really fundamental questions of purpose, fundamental questions of whyness, fundamental questions of, they are the questions that are sort of just the step beyond philosophy. And so I think what's interesting is to understand that a lot of the stuff that was over here historically, particularly in philosophy, has migrated over, and I don't mean I mean to David, but migrated over to questions of empiricism. And that's a huge shift. So then one of the most fundamental questions that surrounds the dialogue that we're having tonight is how much gets shifted over. Does ultimately human nature become fundamentally revealed to us? Are we capable of that? There are meaningful, extremely thoughtful, rigorous scientists who believe we are incapable of fundamentally, purely understanding ourselves, that we'll have to actually migrate to another place. And there are people who feel that we'll get there very soon. So there's a spectrum of opinions.
That might be true that we're incapable, but to say a scientist believes it would be a leap of faith on the scientist's part.
Of course.
I think a better approach...
From the data, is what I think what they were saying.
That's right, but still they shouldn't say believe. They should say one possibility is that we will never be able to understand ourselves that way. Because, well, you know an analogy that I use on this sometimes, which is that science is building slats on a pier, and the pier goes out over the water. But what a life in science really teaches is the vastness of that ocean and how much, I mean, there's no way in our lifetime we're going to get many more piers out, even if we're building faster than we ever did. It's a huge ocean out there of all the uncharted knowledge. What I think there's no guarantee about is how far that bridge will take us. We may run out, the scientific method may well run out. So I agree with the sentiment, which is that it might, but I wouldn't say it for sure will or for sure won't.
Well, let's talk about one aspect of this. So philosophy and religion is ultimately about understanding the self. This is true of religion as well. You disagree that philosophy is about the self, that it's not,
I mean,
the self isn't the...
I think we have to be, I mean this genuinely, I think we have to be spiritually humble in the sense that to answer that question spiritually, I think it might narcissistically look, I'm a New Yorker, right? It's all about me. You're all about me, right? It's all happening to me, right? I get that. And so do you, obviously, right? But the reality is that I think actually what much of the narrative of spiritual practice, and it really is embodied practice, right, is actually about the transcendence of the self and the deep, an awakening to other modalities of reality beyond the self in a profound, in a way that can be profoundly shocking to that ego.
Right. I mean, that's absolutely
which is why
the truth when it comes to, I mean, again, going back to mysticism, whether you're talking about the Atman in the Eastern traditions, the idea of the self that has to be negated, or whether you're talking about, or that it not has to be negated, that is just simply an illusion, or whether you're talking about the more Western conception of the self or the ego as something that has to be overcome. Even with religion, I mean, we talk a lot about how, God made man in his image, but the truth is that man made God in his image. And so this leads me to this wonderful question from someone in the audience about the self. And I think we can talk about the self in philosophy, we can talk about the self in religion, but the question here is, how does one talk about the self? Where does the self fit in neuroscience?
I can tell you that in one sentence. Half of us is other people. So because of brain plasticity, the capacity for the brain to reconfigure itself, every experience I've had my whole life has wired me up to be the way that I am. And the thing about this, the body is, it seems like a convenient place to draw a border. So I say, okay, well, I'm separate from you guys. But in fact, we are such products of our culture. And if we do this exercise of imagining that we were 2,000 years ago in Greece eating grapes and so on, not only would we be using different vocabulary, but we wouldn't even be recognizable as ourselves, because all of the culture would get poured into our nervous system and make us very different types of people. So the self involves now, I mean, in science labs, it involves the amount of lead in the air. It involves the things people say to you. It involves the things that your mother ate and smoked when you were in the womb. It involves the culture that you're embedded in.
But what about the relationship between the self and perception and reality? I mean, obviously all of those things are involved in that.
Yeah, we are, because we've positioned our eyeballs right here, we walk around, and this is the point of view that we tend to get the most. But I think this is one of the changes from technology, is seeing yourself as a data point on on some app that you can zoom out on and understand you are part of a bigger structure, and there's all kinds of intersubjective stuff going on.
Yeah.
I think that's the really exciting change there.
You guys are like the perfect bridges to these questions. This is from Sedona. So it's about a psychologist, a writer in Washington, D.C. named Valerie Terrico. Does anybody know Valerie Terrico? Who wrote that religion will die on the internet. Now, I'm going to change this a little bit.
Wow.
I don't think religion will die on the internet. We've been talking about the death of religion for a very, very long time, and it turns out that God is very much alive still.
He's gone viral.
Much to a lot of people's dismay.
Huge.
So
it's like God and cats.
Yeah.
They're like right neck and neck.
Yeah, grumpy cats and grumpy God. So let me change this a little bit and just say, what is the internet doing to religion? What's the internet doing to faith, in the same way that David just talked about, the sort of many points of existence?
I have, I want to come back to this last question before no, not now, but in a few minutes. This sort of question about where the self begins and what are human universals. But I'll reflect on this. I run an organization called PopTech. We bring together scientists and technologists and engineers and designers and people working at the forefront of social and ecological innovation, all different kinds of fields, to work together on new approaches to tough problems around the world. And every year we have a big annual gathering up in Maine where we bring these folks together. And one year we invited a guy named Martin Marty, who is a famous theologian, who did a 20-something volume, a definitive set of works on fundamentalism. And together with Richard Dawkins. We're like, it was like throwing two cats in a bag. What's going to happen? And the answer is they're totally gentlemanly and falling over each other to be graceful, and it was totally disappointing. But Marty said something really interesting in his universal study of fundamentalism around the world and through history, which is that one of the first purposes that technologies are put to is the use by religious minorities to produce religious materials. This happens all over the place. And so what you find is so think about the internet, right? You are exposed to a subset of the totality of human knowledge that is heavily weighted, like if you look at Wikipedia, it's heavily weighted toward the Wikipedia includes a chapter, a page, it's about, 1,500 words long on, say, World War II, and about 10,000 words long on Klingon. So it's a little biased. but if you look at it as a subset of what we know, what's fascinating about this is that how could something like Wahhabist radical Islam live in a world exposed to all those ideas? And the answer is actually pretty obvious, because the people use those very tools to produce their own signals that reinforce, to produce a sort of solipsistic loop in which they use the very access to media production to produce media that they just live with very close up. Like you might visit a half a dozen websites. You're not going out to visit every single website on a daily basis. So I think in some ways the internet is the most powerful tool for the diffusion of edge spiritual concepts yet invented, because it enables small communities, whether we think of them as beneficial or malignant or however we judge them, to become more coherent at smaller scales.
So that seems right, but it may be the thing that saves us from that also, just because not everybody's going to have the gumption to go out and seek out other opinions, but for the first time in history, those are available. And so if you lived in wherever, and you in the past could not even hear another point of view, now the opportunity to become worldly and get a sharper focus on your own culture by seeing all the others, at least is there for those who want to seek it.
And I'll add just one other part to this. What I'm really interested in when it comes to religion is formation of communities, which ultimately is what religion is about. It's a language of symbols and metaphors that allows individuals in a community to communicate with each other about this ineffable experience that they have, this experience of transcendence. Communicate with each other and also communicate with themselves. And these symbols provide this a ready-made language in the way that German or French or Latin or whatever it may be. And just to explain what I mean, so in other words, I don't have to describe this sort of indescribable experience of salvation. All I have to say is that I've been washed in the blood of the Lamb. And
born
if
again.
you, right, or I've been born again, and if you're in my community, you know what I mean. And so we use the same symbols to communicate that experience, that ineffable experience. What I think is amazing about what the internet has done to religion, not what it's done to faith, but what it's done to religion, is that it's created these micro communities whereby as a result of just the coming together of these post-materialist values, values that don't have to do with sustenance or security or shelter, that it's allowed for a hyper-individualisation, for sort of micro communities. It's sectarianism on crack, if you will. It's just every single avenue that a particular faith can lead you, every single interpretation of a set of symbols and metaphors now has its own community on the internet. So that's what I find as a historian of religion, very fascinating.
Can I just challenge that for 1 second?
Yeah,
I'm just
please.
wondering if in small geographical pockets, this has always been happening, the speciation of religion. We just don't ever find it because they only last a generation and then the kids move off.
Well, what's really fascinating is you said it perfectly. It's usually in geographic pockets when this kind of thing happens. When a religion or a church has a disagreement about some fundamental aspect of dogma, and it splits, and you have the 5th Church of Christ and the 6th Church of Christ. In 2 avenues. In this case, however, there are no borders. It's borderless. There are no boundaries. It could be, a kid living in Indonesia and a kid living in Los Angeles, and they both think that Metallica is God. And so forget about language, forget about geography, forget about culture and ethnicity, which is usually the things around which communities, certainly geography, around which communities are formed. Take that away, and you see this kind of sudden acceleration of the fragmentation of these communities.
The anthropologist Grant McCracken wrote a really wonderful book on the subject of cultural fragmentation. When anthropologists in the 1950s used to study young people in the United States, they would identify them by groups, and some of you who might have been teenagers at that time remember you had the jocks and the nerds and the guys with the DA haircuts, and you had maybe 6 or 7 varieties. And what happened as the result of mass media prior to the internet was a massive fragmentation of cultural categories that was ongoing and accelerating before the internet arrived, so that a cultural anthropologist studying American teenagers today has to study non-vampiric goth kids who don't drink and non-vampiric goth kids who do drink. And Freud has this wonderful phrase, it's a developmental phrase called the narcissism of small difference. It's a developmental phase when you say, I'm not you, mom or dad, because your nose is shaped like this and my nose is shaped like this and my eyes are this color and yours. And what you find is the narcissism of small difference exists just to your exact point between the Sixth-day Adventists and the Seventh-day Adventists on opposite sides of the street, between those cultural categories. So it's like, we speak Klingon and they speak Klingon and we're both Trekkies, but they don't follow the expansion pack that was issued in 1987. So screw them. We're going to beat them up in the parking lot.
Right.
So totally bizarro. I think the internet accelerates that fragmentation.
Question from Cincinnati, and I'll just summarize it. Does science have room for the soul? I mean, is there?
So it depends what we mean by the soul, I think.
Okay, so what do we mean by it?
So what I think of when I think of the soul is that we really miss somebody when they die. There's something about them that's very special. The personality, the personality, the way we think about things. All the stuff you miss when somebody dies. I think that's what we mean by the soul sometimes.
Does the soul have any matter to it?
So we don't actually know. The prevalent hypothesis in neuroscience is what's called materialism, which is that if you take all the pieces and parts of the brain, and if you reproduce it out of beer cans and tennis balls, and it runs the same algorithms, then it should be you. It should still be you. And if we said, hey, Reza, are you in there? How you feeling? You'd say, it's a little cold down here, whatever, but it's you. And it's a pretty good hypothesis, and the reason that it drives the field is because what's totally clear is that when people damage parts of their brain, even very tiny parts of their brain, they change. And who you think of as that person you loved is now someone a little bit different. And of course, when people put invisibly small molecules like alcohol into their system, that changes your personality in the moment. Drugs, medications, all these things change people. So that's how we know that somehow you are irrevocably tied to this 3 pounds of biological tissue. And I think that's why materialism really has legs. Just to be safe and to make sure I'm open about this, we don't actually know in neuroscience that materialism is correct. It's the best hypothesis we have. It's what gets us out of bed and go into the lab in the morning. Mm-hmm. There are other hypotheses that are possible, though, for sure.
What do you think?
I think about the language we use about the word soul and 3 different ways we use it. So we talk about it as everyone here has a soul. Does anyone here not have a soul? Right. Everybody. Oh, there's one
couple
guy.
of people in the back.
2 people. Yeah. There's 2 people here without souls. But 98% of you, right, presumably think you have one. And I think what's interesting about that is a social fact. It's a social idea, right? We use that idea all the time it actually mediates and informs many decisions we make about healthcare, and makes about who's a person and who's not, and but this idea that there's something eternal, ineffable, unique, and daisy-like about each of us, right? That's one way in which we socialize the concept of the soul. The second way...
Wait, sorry, those are separate issues, though, eternal and unique. I
Yeah.
mean, we're all different on the inside, but the eternal part, is that what you mean by soul when you ask the question?
Well, I just use it for the moment to
Okay.
say, let's just posit. I meant more of this sort of universalist aspect of everybody's got one, or we tend to, in many of our day-to-day interactions, I'm talking about embedded in our culture and our language, this terminology exists. There's a second way in which we think about the soul as a thing which is cared for and fed. The care and feeding of the soul. Right? You make decisions, right? And it's in direct contradiction to the idea that there is some sort of universal, pure thing, right? Because you are affecting it, right? Which is a paradox. We don't often put those ideas together. And then there's a third way, which is sort of at the end of that spectrum, in which we talk about great souls. Well, that person was a great soul, right? They were truly, there was something about their humanity or something about their spirit that just radiated and touched all around them. And so there's a sense then, which is sort of the opposite of uniqueness, right? And so what's interesting to me is that actually this one term actually has incredibly confused and diffused and used in very different ways, and has attached to it many different, it's either influenceable or it's not influenceable, it's unique or it's not, it's eternal or it's not, it's a lot of things. So I think what often happens is just to ask the question, you have to unfold what you're actually talking, the modalities of different dimensions of being, eternal and contingent, all of those different things, they all are implicated in one way, in a word that we toss out glibly in a question.
That's why I didn't know whether to raise my hand when you said, does everyone feel like they have a soul? I didn't even know what that would mean.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I'm not sure that necessarily everybody in this room, myself included, thinks the same thing when we do decide to raise or lower.
Descartes famously posited that you've got the body and then you've got this separate thing, this immaterial bit, the ghost in the machine, that I think is often what we mean by soul. But the sort of neuroscience insider joke on it is that Descartes never saw a patient with brain damage, because as soon as you see that, and the person's someone completely different now, it opens up a trap door under that idea, I think.
Right. David, can I ask you just a follow-up, really small thing? So you spent, one of the things I think everyone would benefit from is you've spent a lot of time at the intersection of neuroscience and law, which when you think about these questions of personhood, personality, intention, responsibility, right? The point at which all of those internal things become the matter of external judgments and the like. You've talked about folks who've suffered brain lesions and had them removed, and could you just use one example, like the pedophile one? I think.
Sure. Yeah, there was a paper about 9 years ago in the literature about a 40-year-old man who had a normal sexual appetite, and he suddenly became a pedophile. He started developing an interest in pedophilia, collected child pornography. He made an inappropriate move, an attempt on his prepubescent stepdaughter that was in the house. And his wife immediately had him arrested. And the night before sentencing, he was having these terrible headaches, and he finally went to the emergency room, and they did a brain scan. They discovered he had a massive frontal lobe tumor. So they did an emergency neurosurgery and removed the tumor, and his sexual behavior returned completely normal, and provably so. And his wife took him back, and everything was great. And about 8 months later, he started showing signs of pedophilia again. So his wife took him back to the doctors. It turns out the surgeons had missed a part of the tumor. It was now regrowing. So they resected it a second time, and his sexual behavior returned to normal a second time. This is one of a million examples we have that you are your brain. And so when we think about things nowadays, like,
is he an evil person or
an evil person?
Yeah.
I'm using my free will to make terrific decisions, and he's using his free will to make evil decisions. It's more complicated than that. When we talk about morality and decision making, we're really talking about the neural basis of it, because whatever the answer is to materialism, it's clear that we're inseparable from this computational material in there. When that changes, we change, and that's what complexifies this notion of of the soul or the self.
Well, let's take this then to the final question here as we're wrapping up. So we're talking about the future of religion. We've talked a great deal about the issues that would define religion in the future. But I mean, this is now that moment where you're going to have to make some sort of prediction, make some sort of grand gesture about what you see religion looking like, being like in the future.
Okay.
Just
On
again,
camera.
on camera
For
yes,
YouTube,
yes.
for
And
all
now,
eternity.
Now, one thing that I will say now, I will say before, and this is just kind of my I'm going to give you a little bit of a safety net here, because the easy answer, which I will not accept from either of you, is that, oh, well, we'll just grow out of it. We'll become smarter, and we'll become richer, and we'll become more developed, and then eventually we won't have any use for religion, and it will just go away. And I just want to remind you that we've been saying that for centuries. And the truth of the matter is, if you believe the surveys that were conducted at the end of the 20th century, that actually larger percentages of human society identify themselves with a religious tradition today than did even 100 years ago. Now, religion itself is changing. When someone says, I'm a Christian in 2013, they mean something completely different than somebody who said that in 1913. But nonetheless, religious affiliation is not diminishing. Some surveys say that it's even on the rise. So don't say, I won't
weren't going to.
I just want to say, do not say it'll just go away. Now you can go ahead and say it. Who wants to start?
I'll start.
Right.
I feel, so look, I'm not as, there's sometimes a misconception that scientists think that that's going to answer everything. We've got F equals ma and equals mc squared, and we're going to keep going, and we're going to sort of come up with a model of the cosmos. But as I mentioned earlier, our toolbox is extremely limited. It'll keep expanding, but we have no guarantees how far it will get. So there's this, but what's really lovely about science is it inspires this yearning to understand the big picture, and this kind of yearning and hopefully critical thinking and open-mindedness and active exploration of new ideas combined with big data and understanding ourselves on new space and time scales. I think what this will lead to is an appreciation of the structure of the possibility space. Mm-hmm. By which I mean, instead of people fighting and dying over this issue of, okay, this particular thing that I grew up with is true, or I know for certain that there's nothing going on, we're just a pebble floating through space in an empty, meaningless universe. Either of these could be right, we don't know, but we waste too much energy having the battle between these two positions, religion and neo-atheism, that I think are too limited for a modern discussion. And so my interest has been in understanding the structure of the space of possibilities. Mm-hmm. So, that's one possibility there. All the Judeo-Christian and Islamic tradition, the Eastern religions, the idea that we were planted here by space aliens, the idea that there are there are civilizations living in spatial dimensions 7 through 11, mm-hmm. the idea that, we shut off when we die and that's the end of it. There are an infinite number of these things we can paint. And what's nice is that science does have the capacity to contribute to understanding the space, because it can carve off parts of the space and throw it away. The idea that there's ESP or crystals or things like that, lovely ideas, but to the degree that we can test them, not true. So we can get rid of those. And science opens up new folds in that space so we can see new things. For example, quantum mechanics. These are concepts we've never even thought of, and then that opens up new ideas. So science can contribute to that, but fundamentally what it comes down to is an issue about what we can be certain about. And all of these things in the possibility space are those things that we don't really have the tools to test. And so instead of picking one and fighting for it, I think the future of religion will be turning our spiritual yearnings into understanding what the answers might be. What ifs instead of what is.
Picking up on that very eloquent thought. So I think a little bit just to your exhortation, as I really animated. Okay, religion's not going away.
My career depends on it.
I understand. I understand. Various tenure decisions and children's educations depend on this idea. But let's take those two ideas and I just offer some final, very wafty speculation. So the first is that I think a lot about the conversation about religion. It reminds me of the contemporary Republican Party, right? Deeply in need of a reboot in some important ways, right? Because if you think about it, in many ways, it's an organized system of beliefs about the world, beliefs about human nature, and about the organization of human society that finds purchase in some people's minds and not in others. And there's a conversation about how to either get the messages out or tweak them in a way to make them palatable to people. And in certain places on the earth, those systems are at a real ebb tide that frankly make the Republican Party look like fantastic winners. I mean, if you look in Europe, they're turning their churches into coffee houses and into really cool condos and things like that. You know, really interesting. Now, that's not to say that there isn't net on the planet, particularly in the global south, a massive explosion of those axial age faiths, predominantly because they speak directly, I think, in many ways to the context in which people are there living their lives. In hyper-cities, newly urbanized, we're in the midst of the largest migration in human history. Right now, the largest number of people in the history of the world are moving from the countryside to the city. And there are systems of belief that are ready-made for people in those circumstances. But it's also true that the relationship between faith and science is a long, long, long one. It stretches out behind us vastly, and it stretches out in front of us vastly. So what could we say about that? Well, some of the current, let's take some non-controversial statements. Some of the faiths that currently exist upon the earth will probably die out for reasons that don't have anything to do with their truth value. They have to do with the fact that right now we're witnessing the loss of one language on earth a week. One of our languages is disappearing, and with it all of the history, as people no longer speak in those terms. Right? Some will continue, and there'll be some new ones. But let me characterize the new ones, and I think what some of the existing ones will need to do to adapt. What do we know today in the most general sense, not this actual day? Well, we know that the arrangement, if we take David's materialist position, I happen to agree with that position, that you can rearrange molecules similar to the ones in this coffee table and get something skinnier and more attractive than me, but something with roughly some kind of cognition, right? That says something very powerful about the nature of this reality. You don't even have to get to the next one to get to this. Something really extraordinary is true, that mindfulness can be derived from stuff is a truth of profound spiritual consequence. A second thought is that whatever comes next will have to be deeply congruent with what we already know, because it can't ask us to reject the truth, but to embrace some deepening of the known truth. So what do we know? Well, we know also that we have a congruent history with the animal kingdom and with, in fact, the entire history of life, and we begin to understand some way in which that happens. And we understand ourselves at the very beginnings of in the context of a vast cosmology, a physical cosmology. So faiths of the future may I think whatever they do, they have to be congruent with the idea that minds can arise from things, that those minds can be made more generous, purposeful, and grateful, and that gratitude can be inculcated. And in fact, encouraging mindfulness and gratitude and awareness is sort of like it's either the first commandment or the precursor to the first commandment or the thing that follows immediately after. I don't sort of care where you put it in the order. But if you are to love others, which is the root of all of those things, that somehow it's to love that truth and to care for one another. And those things aren't going anywhere. There's going to be more of us and more problems to deal with, so I think it's going to only become more relevant. But the precise forms are going to have to be congruent with a different body of truth.
Well, I have to admit that I'm a geek, so this is my idea of a good time. And I really, really enjoyed this conversation with my two friends. I want to encourage you guys as we close out this evening to purchase the books of David and Andrew. I've read both of these. They're fantastic. Resilience is incredible work. Incognito will blow your mind. But for now, let's all thank David Eagleman and Andrew Zolli.
And Reza. Let's thank
Andrew.
Reza.
Thank you
Thank you very
guys.
much. That was fun.